Good morning. My name is Mike Grove. I'm going to be conducting this directed in-service for you. You have a handout in front of you and you have a post-test to be taken, and you can fill that out as we go through if you see the answers on the slides. This in-service is due to a deficiency that was cited in a recent survey for your facility. This is F689. It states that the facility will make certain that the residence environment is free of accident hazards. Supervision devices revealed that the nursing home failed to supervise subordinate staff to assure that the resident windows and common areas of 2 units were secured. This actually had to do with a resident who had emotional distress, and there was fear that this resident would elope. The F689 states that the facility must ensure that the resident environment remains as free of accident hazards as is possible, and each resident receives adequate supervision and assistive devices to prevent accidents. Under this standard is also the quality of care requirement. It's the fundamental principle that applies to all treatment and care provided to the facility residents based on the comprehensive assessment of the resident. The facility must ensure that the resident receives treatment and care in accordance with professional standards of care, a person-centered care plan, and resident choices included but not limited to the following. Facility must attempt to use appropriate alternatives prior to installing a side or bed rail. If a bed or side rail is used, the facility must ensure the correct installation, use, and maintenance of the bed rails, including but not limited to the following elements. Assess the resident for the risk of entrapment from bed rails prior to the installation. Review the risks and benefits of the bed rails with the resident or their representative, and obtain informed consent prior to the installation. Ensure that the bed's dimensions are appropriate for the resident's size and weight. Ensure that the mattress on the bed fits in a manner to not present a safety hazard. To ensure the facility provides an environment that is free from accident hazards over which the facility has control, and provides supervision and assistive devices to each resident to prevent avoidable accidents. This includes identifying hazards and risks, evaluating and analyzing hazards and risks, implementing interventions to reduce hazards and risks, and monitoring for effectiveness and modifying interventions when necessary. The following definitions are provided to clarify terms related to providing supervision and other interventions to prevent accidents. An accident is an unexpected or unintentional incident which may result in injury or illness to the resident. This does not include adverse outcomes that are direct consequences of treatment of care that is provided in accordance with current standards of practice. For example, drug side effects or a reaction. Avoidable accident means that it occurred because the facility failed to identify the environmental hazard, they failed to evaluate and analyze the hazard, they failed to implement interventions, and they failed to monitor the effectiveness. You can be following along with your copy of this PowerPoint as we go through. An unavoidable accident is an accident that occurred despite sufficient and comprehensive facility systems that were designed and implemented. The facility performed the above tasks of identifying, evaluating and analyzing, implementing, and monitoring for effectiveness of their interventions. Assistive device is any item such as handrails, grab bars, and devices such as transfer lifts, canes, wheelchairs that are used by or in the care of the resident to promote, supplement, or enhance the resident's function and or safety. The environment refers to the resident environment. It includes the physical surroundings to which the resident has access, such as the room, the unit, the common use areas, and facility grounds, etc. A fall refers to an unintentional coming to rest on the ground, floor, or other lower level, but not as a result of an overwhelming external force. For example, a resident pushes another resident. An episode where a resident loses their balance and would have fallen if you would not have intervened is also considered a fall. A fall without injury is still a fall, unless there is evidence suggesting otherwise. When a resident is found on the floor, a fall is considered to have occurred. Hazards are those elements in the resident's environment that have the potential to cause injury or illness. Hazards over which the facility has control are those hazards in the resident environment where responsible efforts by the facility could influence the risk for resulting injury or illness. And free of accident hazards, as is possible, refers to being free of accident hazards over which the facility has control. Risk refers to any external force, factor, or characteristic of an individual resident that influences the likelihood that they could have an accident. Adequate supervision is defined as intervention and means of mitigating the risk of an accident. The facility is obligated to provide adequate supervision to prevent accidents. Adequate supervision is defined by the type and frequency of supervision based on the individual resident's assessed needs and identified hazards in the resident environment. Adequate supervision may vary from resident to resident and from time to time for the same resident. The responsibility is to ensure the safest environment possible for residents. Numerous and varied accident hazards exist in everyday life. Not all accidents are avoidable. The frailty of some residents increase their vulnerability to hazards in the resident environment and can result in life-threatening injuries. Both the facility and the facility staff have a responsibility to provide the safest environment possible for the resident. The residents are exposed to some potential for harm. Although hazards should not be ignored, there are varying degrees of potential for harm. It is reasonable to accept some risk as a trade-off for the potential benefits such as maintaining dignity, self-determination, and control over one's daily life. The facility's challenge is to balance protecting the resident's right to make choices and the facility's responsibility to comply with regulations. Consent by the resident or responsible party alone does not relieve the provider of its responsibility to assure the health, safety, and welfare of its residents, including protecting them from avoidable accidents. Federal regulations affirm the resident's right to participate in care planning and to refuse treatment. The regulations do not create the right for a resident, legal surrogate, or representative to demand the facility use specific medical interventions or treatments that the facility deems inappropriate. Regulations hold the facility ultimately accountable for the resident's care and safety. Verbal or signed consent forms do not eliminate a facility's responsibility to protect the resident from an avoidable accident. Effective ways that you can avoid accidents: commit to a safety and implementation system that addresses residents' risk and environmental hazards to minimize the likelihood of any accidents. Acknowledge the high-risk nature of your population and the setting. Develop a reporting system that does not place blame on the staff member for reporting resident risks and environmental hazards. Involve all staff in helping identify solutions to ensure a safe resident environment. Directs resources to address safety concerns and demonstrates a commitment to safety at all levels of the organization. A system approach is one that establishes and utilizes a systematic approach to resident safety. It helps the facility comply with the regulations. A key element of such a system approach is consistent application of a process to consistently address identified hazards and/or risks. Risks may pertain to individual residents, groups of residents, or the entire facility. A systems approach also identifies hazards that may include but are not limited to aspects of the physical plant, equipment, devices that are defective or are not used properly for the manufacturer's specifications. They're disabled, removed, or are not individually adapted to the resident's specific needs. A systems approach allows the facility to adjust its responses depending on the urgency of the situation and the hazards identified. This process through which the facility becomes aware of potential hazard is in the resident environment and the risk of the resident having an avoidable accident. All staff, including the professional staff, administration, maintenance, etc., are to be involved in observing and identifying potential hazards in the environment, while taking into consideration the unique characteristics and abilities of each resident. Various sources provide information about hazards and risks in the resident environment. These sources may include, but are not limited to, quality assurance activities, environmental rounds, the MDS, the CAA's data, medical history and physical exam, and individual observations. All disciplines should document and communicate this type of information. The process of examining data to identify specific hazards and risks, and to develop targeted interventions to reduce the potential for accidents. Interdisciplinary involvement is a critical component of this process. Analysis may include, for example, considering the severity of hazards, the immediacy of risk, and the trends such as the time of day, location, etc. Interventions also refer to using specific interventions to try to reduce a resident's risk from hazards in the environment. It includes communicating the interventions to all relevant staff, assigning responsibility, providing training as needed, documenting interventions. Examples are a plan of action developed by the Quality Assurance Committee, or care plans for the individual resident, and ensuring that the interventions are put into action. Development of interim safety measures may be necessary if interventions cannot be immediately implemented. Facility-based interventions could include educating staff, repairing the device or equipment, and developing and revising policies and procedures. Resident-directed approaches may include implementing specific interventions as part of the plan of care, supervising the staff and residents, etc. Facility records document the implementing of such interventions. Monitoring is the process of evaluating the effectiveness of an intervention. Modification is the process of adjusting interventions as needed to make them more effective in addressing hazards and risks. An example of facility-specific modification is additional training of staff when equipment has been upgraded or changed. An example of a resident-specific modification is revising the plan of care to reflect the resident's current condition and risk factors that may have changed since the previous assessment was completed. An intervention and a means of mitigating accident and risk. Adequacy is also defined by the type and frequency based on the individual resident's assessed needs and identified hazards in the resident's environment. Tools or items such as personal alarms can help to monitor a resident's activities, but do not eliminate the need for adequate supervision. A resident environment may contain temporary hazards such as construction, painting, housekeeping activities, etc., that warrant additional supervision or alternative measures. If facility permits residents to smoke tobacco products, they must assess the residents' capabilities and define any deficits that determine whether or not supervision is required. This information must be included in the resident's plan of care and reviewed and revised periodically. The facility may designate certain areas for the resident's smoking. The facility must ensure precautions are taken for the resident's individual safety, as well as the safety of others in the facility. This may include smoking only in designated areas, supervising residents whose assessment and plan of care indicate the need for supervision, and limiting the accessibility of matches and lighters by residents who need such supervision. Smoking by residents when oxygen is in use is, of course, prohibited, and any smoking by others near flammable substances is also problematic. Additional measures may include informing all visitors of smoking policies and hazards. Resident-to-resident altercations. A facility should have taken reasonable precautions, including adequate supervision when the risk of resident-to-resident altercation is identified or should have been identified. A history of aggressive behaviors, including striking out, verbal outbursts, or negative interactions with others. Behaviors that tend to disrupt or annoy others, such as constant verbalizations, examples, crying, yelling, calling out for help, making negative remarks, restlessness, repetitive behaviors, taking items that do not belong to them, going to others' rooms, drawers, or closets, and undressing in inappropriate areas. Although these behaviors may not be aggressive in nature, they may precipitate a negative response from others, resulting in verbal, physical, and/or emotional harm. Residents who do have a history of disruptive or intrusive interactions or exhibit other possible objectionable behaviors, the facility should identify the factors that increase the risk associated with these individual residents. The care planning team should review the assessment along with the resident and/or his or her representative in order to identify interventions to try to prevent altercations. Provide a safe, supervised area for unrestricted movement. Eliminate or reduce underlying causes of distressed behavior such as boredom and pain. Monitor environmental influences such as temperature, lighting, and noise levels. Evaluate staff assignments to ensure consistent staff who are familiar with each of the residents. Evaluating staffing levels to ensure you are providing adequate supervision. Ongoing staff training and supervision, including how to approach a resident who may be agitated. Common potential hazards found in the resident's environment are such things as the physical plant, devices, and equipment. Any equipment that's discussed may not be hazard by themselves, but can become hazardous when a vulnerable resident interacts with them. In order to be considered hazardous, an element of the resident environment must be accessible to a vulnerability. Ongoing assessment helps identify when elements in the environment pose hazards to a particular resident. Certain sharp items, such as scissors, kitchen utensils, knitting needles, or other items, may be appropriate for some residents and hazardous for others. Handrails, assistive devices, and any surface that a resident may come in contact with may cause injury if the surface is not in good condition. Improper actions or omissions by staff create hazards in the physical plant environment and or with devices and equipment. Examples might include fire doors that have been propped open, disabled locks or latches, non-functioning alarms, cords on floors, access to toxic chemicals, unsafe water temperatures, etc. Other potential hazards: lighting that is inadequate, chairs, or beds that are too low or unstable. Devices for resident care, such as pumps, ventilators, and assistive devices, may be hazardous when they are defective, disabled, or improperly used in a manner that is not per manufacturer's recommendations or current standards of practice. Other vulnerabilities, falls and unsafe wandering, elopement, are of particular concern. Moving about the facility aimlessly may indicate that the resident is frustrated, anxious, bored, hungry, or depressed. Elopement occurs when a resident leaves the premises or a safe area without authorization, in order for discharge or leave of absence, and or necessary supervision to do so. A resident who leaves a safe environment may be at risk for or has a potential to experience heat or cold exposure, dehydration, and or other medical complications such as drowning or being struck by a motor vehicle. Muscle weakness and gait problems account for 24% of nursing home falls. Environmental hazards cause 16 to 27% of falls for residents. The physical plant hazards, supervision, and or containment of hazards are needed to protect residents from harm caused by environmental hazards. Examples of such hazards can range from common chemical cleaning materials to those caused by adverse water temperatures or improper use of electrical devices. One source of information concerning the hazards of material that the facility may obtain is in your material safety data sheets. Water temperatures may reach hazardous temperatures in hand sinks, showers, and tubs. Burns related to hot water liquids may also be due to spills and or immersion. Many residents in long-term care facilities have conditions that may put them at increased risk for burns caused by scalding. The degree of injury depends on the factors including the water temperature, the amount of skin exposed, and the duration of the exposure. Some states have regulations allowing maximum water temperatures. In the state of Pennsylvania, that is 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Severity of burns are stated in degrees: first degree, second degree, and third degree. Examples of third-degree burn injury by temperature and time exposure is 120 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 minutes, 127 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 minute, 133 for 15 seconds, 140 for 5 seconds, 148 for 2 seconds. Electrical safety is another concern. An electrical device, whether or not it needs to be plugged into an outlet, can become hazardous to the resident through improper use or improper maintenance. If extension cords are used, the cord should be properly secured and not be placed overhead, under carpets or rugs, or anywhere that the cords can cause trips, falls, or overheat. A resident should not go to sleep with an electric blanket or a heating pad turned on. Lighting. The risk of an accident increases when there is insufficient light or too much light, which often results in glare. An older person typically needs more light to see. However, a resident with cataracts or glaucoma may be overly sensitive to bright light, and excessive lighting could make it more difficult to see clearly and thereby increase his or her fall risk. Providing supplemental light near beds for residents who are mobile may assist in safe mobility at night. Assistive devices and equipment hazards. Assistive devices and equipment can help residents move with increased independence, transfer, and greater comfort, and feel physically more secure. However, there are risks associated with such devices and equipment, and these risks need to be balanced with the benefits gained from their use. Training of staff, residents, family members, and volunteers on the proper use of assistive devices and equipment is crucial to prevent accidents. Assistive devices may include all types of devices such as canes, stand and rolling walkers, manual or non-powered wheelchairs, and powered wheelchairs. Three primary factors that may be associated with an increased accident risk related to the use of assistive devices include the resident's condition, personal fit, and device condition, and the staff practices. Devices can pose a hazard if not fitted and or maintained properly. Mechanical assistive devices for transfer include but are not limited to portable total body lifts, ceiling mounted and mechanical lifts, sit-to-stand devices, and transfer or gait belts. The resident assessment helps to determine the resident's degree of mobility and physical impairment and the proper transfer method, for example, whether one or more caregivers or a mechanical device is needed for safe transfer of the particular resident. Factors that may influence a resident's risk of accident during transfer include staff availability, resident abilities, and staff training. All devices and equipment must be used in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations and with the recommended parts. Physical restraints are devised as any manual method, physical or mechanical device, material, or equipment attached to or adjacent to the resident's body that the individual cannot remove easily and that restricts freedom of movement or normal access to one's body. Serious injuries as well as death have been reported as a result of using physical restraints. Severe injury, strangulation, and asphyxiation. Restrained residents may be injured or die when they try to remove restraints, to ambulate while restrained, or due to an improperly fitting or improperly used device. Regardless of the purpose for use, bed rails, also referred to as side rails, bedside rails, safety rails, assistive rails, some places call them, and other bed accessories, transfer bar, bed enclosures, while assisting with transfer and positioning, can increase the resident's safety risk. Technical uses such as proper size of mattresses, fit and integrity of the bed rails or other design elements, wide spaces between bars and the bed rails, etc., can also affect the risk of a resident for entrapment. The use of specific air-filled mattresses or therapeutic air-filled bed may also present an entrapment risk, which is different than the above. For example, an air-filled mattress can compress on the side to which a person moves, thus raising the center of the mattress and lowering that side. This makes it easier for a resident to slide off the mattress and become entrapped between the mattress and the railing. The mattress then can re-expand and press the chest, neck, or head against that rail. Precautions may include following the manufacturer equipment alerts, assistive devices that create hazards, such as devices that are defective, not used properly, or according to manufacturer specifications, disabled or removed, not provided or do not meet the resident's needs, such as poor fit or not adapted, and or used without adequate supervision when it is required. In summary, the facility must ensure the resident environment remains as free from accident hazards as is possible. Each resident receives adequate supervision and assistance devices to prevent accidents. Care plan interventions and Cardex items are followed by all staff. We now conclude this presentation. Please take a few minutes and complete your post-test and return it to the Director of Nursing. You also have a handout outlining all of the requirements for this FTAG, and you're welcome to take those with you